"Sir, I'm going to need you to step back behind the rope. This is a restricted area, and we got a real situation with this aircraft right now, and we don't have time for tourists." That's what the young man in the ground crew vest said to the 78-year-old veteran on the cane who had just hobbled past the spectator line and was making his slow, deliberate way across the hot tarmac of the Heart of Texas Regional Air Show, 20 miles outside Waco, on a windy Saturday afternoon in May. Behind the young man, a freshly restored 1968 UH-1H Huey sat on the asphalt with its rotor turning at idle, and 3 certified rotorcraft mechanics in matching red coveralls were arguing in raised voices around the cowling, and the pilot was leaning out of the left-hand cockpit window with his face the colour of an eggshell. Because for the third time in 90 minutes the bird had spun up to takeoff RPM, started to lift, developed a low-frequency wobble in the rotor disc that had felt to the pilot's hands like the whole airframe was about to come apart in mid-air, and aborted back down onto the asphalt with the kind of bounce that makes everybody on the ground forget how to breathe for a second. The old man on the cane did not stop. He kept walking. He cocked his head slightly to the right, the way a man cocks his head when he is listening for something specific, in a sound he has heard before, and his pale blue eyes never left the rotor disc spinning 12 feet above the ground. He walked around the young man in the vest. He walked past 2 more ground crew. He walked up to the side of the Huey, set the tip of his cane against the skid, looked up at the rotor head one time, and in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the engine, he said, "Your Jesus nut is a quarter turn shy. Shut her down. I'll fix it in 30 seconds. The lead mechanic laughed. The pilot did not. Because the pilot, looking down at the old man's face from the cockpit window, had just seen something he was not yet ready to believe. If you understand what the words Jesus nut mean to a man who has flown a Huey in combat, type the word airborne into the comments before another second of this story rolls past you, because what happened in the next 4 minutes on that tarmac is the kind of thing that turns a regional air show into a story that gets told in flight bars and VFW halls for the next 50 years. Specialist 5 Earl Doc Callaway, United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division, 1968 to 1970, had not woken up that Saturday morning planning to climb on top of a helicopter. Earl had woken up at 5:15 in his small ranch-style house on the edge of Hewitt, Texas, the way he woke up every morning in the dark to the soft sound of his refrigerator humming and the slightly louder sound of the wall clock his late wife Doris had hung in the hallway in 1981, and that he had not been able to bring himself to take down in the 4 years since she'd passed. He had made coffee. He had eaten 1 egg over hard on a piece of dry toast. He had taken his blood pressure pill and his blood thinner, and the small white pill the cardiologist had added to the regimen 6 months ago that Earl had decided not to ask too many questions about. He had gotten dressed in clean blue work pants, a white t-shirt under a faded olive field jacket that had been his since 1968, and the only pair of boots he still owned that were comfortable enough to walk in for more than an hour. He had picked up the cane that lived next to the front door, the cane he had refused to use for the first 6 months after the doctor had told him he needed it, and had begun to use eventually because he had grown tired of falling, and he had walked out to the driveway and gotten into his 1996 Ford F250, and he had driven the 18 miles to the regional airport outside Waco, where the Heart of Texas Regional Air Show was running for the second day of its 3-day weekend. He had not driven there for himself. Earl had not been to an air show in 26 years, since the day in 1999 when he had taken Doris to a small show outside Killeen, and had stood beside her at the rope line, and had watched a restored Huey lift off the runway, and had felt his entire chest fill up with something so heavy that he had not been able to speak for the next 3 hours, and Doris had not pushed him to speak, the way Doris had never pushed him to speak about any of it for the entire 43 years they had been married. He had driven to the show today because of his great-grandson, a boy named Mason, who was 9 years old and who had been talking about helicopters since he was 4, and who had asked Earl, the previous Sunday at the family lunch, in the small, careful voice 9-year-old boys use when they are asking for something. They are afraid the answer will be no to, if Earl could maybe come with him and his daddy to the air show next weekend, because the program said there was going to be a real Vietnam helicopter there, and Mason wanted to see it with his great-grandpa. Earl had looked at the boy across the kitchen table for a long second. Then he had said yes. He had said it before he had thought about it. He had said it because the boy was 9 years old, and because 9-year-old boys did not stay 9 for very long, and because the boy had asked, and because in 55 years of being asked by children and grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren about helicopters, Earl Callaway had said no every single time, and he had decided sometime between the boy's question and his own answer that he had said no enough. He had met Mason and his father and his mother at the spectator gate that morning at 10 o'clock. Mason had been wearing a small blue ball cap with an embroidered Huey on the front that his mother had bought him at a hobby store in Waco, and the boy had taken Earl's hand the second they were past the gate and had not let go for the next 2 hours. They had walked the static display together. They had looked at the World War II trainers and the Korean-era jets and the modern Apaches that the Texas Army National Guard had brought to fly the Saturday demo. They had eaten kettle corn out of the same paper bag. And then, just before the 1 o'clock airshow program was scheduled to start, they had walked together to the southern end of the tarmac where the restored 1968 UH-1H Huey was supposed to take off and fly a 15-minute demonstration over the runway, and Earl Callaway had stopped at the rope line and looked across 40 feet of asphalt at a helicopter he had not seen running in 56 years, and his entire body had gone very still in the way a body goes still when something old and patient and waiting wakes up inside it. He had stood there for 10 minutes while the ground crew did their final walk around. He had stood there for another 10 minutes while the pilot ran up the engine, and then, when the bird had spun up to take off RPM and started to lift and immediately developed the low-frequency wobble that everybody on the tarmac could feel in the soles of their feet, Earl Callaway had cocked his head slightly to the right and had begun to listen with the kind of attention that 60 years of distance from a sound does not erase from a man's bones. He had heard it on the first abort. He had heard it again on the second abort. And on the third abort, when the bird had bounced harder than the time before and the lead mechanic in the red coveralls had started shouting at the other two mechanics, and the pilot had leaned out of the cockpit window with his face the colour of an eggshell, Earl Callaway had let go of his great-grandson's hand very gently and had said to the boy's father, "Garrett, hold the boy's hand for me, son. I'll be right back." And he had stepped over the rope line slowly, with both hands on his cane, and had begun to walk across the hot asphalt toward the helicopter. The Heart of Texas Regional Air Show had been running on that strip of Central Texas runway for 23 years, and it had a reputation in the warbird community as the kind of small, well-run, family-friendly show that pulled in the right kind of crowds and the right kind of aircraft and the right kind of pilots. The 1968 UH-1H Huey on the tarmac that afternoon was the centerpiece aircraft of the entire weekend. It belonged to a private museum out of Dallas called the Lone Star Vertical Flight Foundation, which had spent the last 6 years and the better part of $2.5 million restoring the bird to flying condition from a derelict airframe they had bought at auction from an estate in Louisiana in 2019. The original tail number, painted in fresh white block letters on both sides of the tail boom and on the underside of the fuselage, was 66-16718, a serial number that the museum's research department had traced back through the National Archives to its original delivery to the Army in November of 1966, its assignment to the 1st Cavalry Division at Ankei in early 1967, and a 14-month combat history in 1st Corps and 2nd Corps that included 38 separate combat assault missions, 2 emergency landings, and 1 hard landing in November of 1969 in a clearing east of the Bong Son Plain that had killed the aircraft commander, wounded the co-pilot, and resulted in the aircraft being recovered by sling load and returned to Vung Tau for repair. The bird had then served 2 more years in Vietnam, had come home in 1972, had spent the rest of the 1970s with a National Guard unit in Arkansas, had been retired to a boneyard in 1981, had been rescued by a private collector in 1994, had passed through 3 more owners over the next 25 years, and had finally landed in the hangar of the Lone Star Vertical Flight Foundation in 2019 with most of its original logbooks miraculously intact in a brown leather folder that had survived all 6 decades and 7 owners by a series of small accidents that the museum's director liked to call divine intervention. The pilot in the cockpit on that windy Saturday afternoon in May was a 48-year-old retired Army major named William Garrison, who had flown AH-64 Apache attack helicopters in Iraq from 2003 to 2009, who had walked away from active duty after his 2nd deployment with all his fingers and most of his hearing, and a quiet, private decision that he was done with combat aviation, and who had spent the 15 years since then flying restored Vietnam-era helicopters for the museum and for 2 other private collectors as a way of staying close to the controls of aircraft that meant something to him. Will Garrison's father had been a Huey pilot in Vietnam in 1968 and 1969. His father had come home in 1970 and had not flown a helicopter again for the rest of his life. His father had died of pancreatic cancer in 2014 at the age of 68, and on the night before his father had died, in a hospital room in Tucson, his father had reached up with one weak hand and grabbed Will by the wrist and had said, in a voice so quiet that Will had to lean down to hear him, "Find Earl Callaway. If you ever fly Hueys for a living, find Earl Callaway and tell him I never forgot what he did for Donnie." Will Garrison had asked his father, "Who is Earl Callaway, Dad? Who is Donnie?" But his father had been too tired to answer, and his father had not been awake again before the end, and Will Garrison had carried the name Earl Callaway in the back of his head for the 11 years since, and had asked every old Vietnam Huey crewman he had met in those 11 years if any of them had known a man by that name, and not one of them had said yes. The lead mechanic on the ground that afternoon was a 36-year-old certified rotorcraft mechanic named Cody Brennan, who had earned his A&P license at a technical school in Oklahoma City, who had 8 years of experience working on Bell 407s and Robinson R44s, and 1 year of experience on Black Hawks at a contract maintenance facility in Fort Hood, and who had been brought onto the Lone Star Vertical Flight Foundation's restoration team 18 months ago specifically because the Foundation needed somebody with modern certifications to sign off on the airworthiness paperwork. Cody Brennan was a competent young mechanic by the standards of modern rotorcraft maintenance. He was not by the standards that mattered to the men who had kept Hueys running in Vietnam in 1968, the kind of mechanic who knew what to listen for. He had, in fact, never been taught to listen for anything at all. He had been taught to read tolerance specifications and run diagnostics and tighten bolts to the foot-pound torques printed in the maintenance manuals, and he had been doing exactly that, in good faith and to the best of his training, for the entire 90 minutes that the Huey had been refusing to lift off, and he had not yet considered the possibility that the answer to the problem he was looking at was not going to be in any maintenance manual printed in the last 40 years. The other two mechanics in red coveralls were both younger than Cody. They were arguing with him about the engine fuel governor when Earl Callaway crossed the rope line. The first person who saw Earl coming across the tarmac was a ground crewman named Jimmy Reyes, who had been watching the spectator line out of the corner of his eye while the mechanics worked, the way you watch a spectator line at an airshow when you're responsible for crowd control and the aircraft you're responsible for is doing things it is not supposed to do. Jimmy Reyes saw the old man in the olive field jacket step over the rope, and his first thought was, "Oh, hell no, not today," and his second thought was, "This is exactly what we don't need right now," and he started walking fast toward the old man with both hands raised in the universal ground crew gesture for "Go back behind the line, sir." Jimmy was 24 years old. He had been working ground crew for the Foundation for 3 years. He was a polite kid by nature, and he had a soft spot for veterans, and he made a point of always being respectful when he had to ask one of them to stay behind the rope at an airshow. But he was also under a great deal of pressure that afternoon because the show director had been on the radio every 5 minutes, asking when the Huey was going to fly its slot, and Jimmy did not have any patience left for civilians wandering onto the tarmac. He intercepted Earl about 20 feet from the helicopter. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back behind the rope. This is a restricted area and we've got a real situation with this aircraft right now, and we don't have time for tourists." Earl did not stop walking. He shifted slightly to his right to step around Jimmy without breaking stride, the way a man steps around a piece of furniture in a room he has known his whole life, and his eyes never came down from the rotor disc that was still spinning at idle 12 feet above the asphalt. Jimmy moved to block him. Sir, please. I am asking you nicely, and I will have to call security if—" "Son," Earl said quietly without slowing down, "I am not a tourist. I crewed this airframe in 1969, tail number 66-16718. I know the sound she makes when her Jesus nut is a quarter turn shy of seated, because I sat under that rotor for 14 months and I learned every sound she could make. Now your pilot is about to abort a 4th time, and the 4th abort is the one that's going to bend something in the rotor mast he can't unbend, and after that, you are going to be looking at a 6-figure repair bill and a grounded aircraft. So I am going to ask you very politely to either get out of my way or to walk in front of me to the cockpit and tell your pilot what I just told you, because either one is fine with me, but the clock is running out on both of us." Jimmy Reyes stopped walking. He did not actually step out of Earl's way. He just stopped, and his mouth opened slightly, because the old man with the cane had said the tail number of the helicopter behind him without looking at it, and Jimmy Reyes happened to know that tail number was the one painted on the bird, because Jimmy Reyes had personally helped the museum's paint contractor mask off the digits of that tail number on both sides of the tail boom 3 months ago. Earl walked past him. Earl walked the last 15 feet to the side of the Huey. The lead mechanic, Cody Brennan, was on the other side of the cowling and had not yet seen him. The 2 younger mechanics had not seen him either. The pilot, Will Garrison, was leaning out of the left-hand cockpit window, with his helmet visor flipped up and his face still the colour of an eggshell, watching the lead mechanic argue with one of the others, and he was the first person on the actual aircraft team to notice the old man approaching from the right side. Will saw the cane first. He saw the slow, deliberate 3-beat walk. He saw the field jacket, and he saw, as Earl came around the side of the bird, the small white name tape sewn above the right breast pocket of the field jacket, which read, in black block letters that had faded slightly with the years but were still perfectly readable in the bright Texas sunlight, Callaway. Will Garrison's mouth went dry. His hand, which had been resting on the collective lever in the cockpit, moved very slowly to the throttle and rolled it back to flight idle. The note of the engine dropped half a tone. Cody Brennan came around the front of the cowling at exactly that moment, saw the old man standing 4 feet from the right skid, and lost his temper. Jimmy, what the hell is this guy doing on my flight line? Get him back behind the rope right now. Jimmy Reyes, who was still standing 20 feet behind Earl, did not answer. Cody took 2 long strides toward Earl, and the heat in his voice was the heat of a man who had been working for 90 minutes on a problem he could not solve, in front of a paying crowd, with the show director on the radio in his earpiece every 5 minutes, and who had reached the exact point in a bad day where the next person to inconvenience him was going to get the full weight of every minute of frustration that had been building up in him since sunrise. Sir, you cannot be here. I don't care what you think you know about helicopters. This is a certified restoration team. We have run every diagnostic in the book on this aircraft. I personally torqued every bolt on the rotor head 2 weeks ago. The Jesus nut is not the problem. The problem is in the fuel governor, and we are going to figure it out, and we are going to figure it out faster, if you are not standing on my flight line interrupting my work. So I am going to ask you one time, and one time only, to please walk back to the rope line before I have to call security and have you walked back. And I would much rather not have to do that, sir, but I will. Earl did not look at Cody Brennan. Earl was looking up at the rotor mast above the helicopter, and his head was tilted at the same slight angle it had been tilted at the entire time, and his pale blue eyes were tracking the tip of the rotor blade as it rotated slowly past in the idle, and his mouth was moving very slightly as though he were counting something. Then he said, again in the same quiet, even voice, but a little louder this time so that the pilot in the cockpit window above and to his left could hear him clearly, Major, shut the engine down. Don't run her up again. The Jesus nut is a quarter turn shy of full seat, and the cotter pin is in, but it's not riding in the keyway right, and what your pilot is feeling in the controls is the rotor disc finding the play in the mast, about every 3 rotations and trying to walk the head off the spline. One more abort like the last one and the spline is going to gall, and after that you're not flying her this weekend or next weekend either. Shut her down, sir. I know how to fix it. It is a 30-second job, and I learned how to do it from a chief warrant officer named Eldon Pace at Vung Tau in 1969. And I have not forgotten how to do it in the 56 years since. The cockpit went silent. Cody Brennan opened his mouth to say something else and then closed it again. Will Garrison sat very still in the left-hand seat of the Huey for the space of 2 full breaths, looking down at the small white name tape that read Callaway on the right breast pocket of the old man's field jacket, and then he reached down with his right hand and pulled the throttle smoothly all the way back to flight idle cutoff, and the steady whine of the Lickerming T-53 turbine engine began to wind down through its descending pitches, and the rotor disc began to slow above their heads, and 1 minute and 20 seconds later the bird was sitting on her skids on the hot asphalt of the Heart of Texas Regional Air Show in absolute mechanical silence, and the only sounds anywhere on that piece of tarmac were the wind across the runway, and the distant murmur of the crowd at the rope line, and the slow, deliberate 3-beat tap of an old man's cane against the side of the aircraft, as he walked around the front of the helicopter to the access steps on the left side. If you're still watching this and you have any idea what's about to happen on top of that helicopter in the next 60 seconds, type the words 30 seconds into the comments before another moment of this story passes. Because what Earl Callaway is about to do on top of a 1968 Huey in front of 1,000 people at a Texas air show is going to come as close to a small public miracle as anything I have ever told a story about. Will Garrison climbed down out of the cockpit before Earl had finished walking around the front of the bird. He took his flight helmet off as he came down the steps and tucked it under his left arm and walked the 4 steps around the nose of the helicopter to where Earl was standing at the base of the access steps on the left side, and he stopped 2 feet in front of him, and he looked down at the old man's face for the space of 1 long second. And then Will Garrison did something he had not done out of uniform in 15 years. He brought his right hand up to his temple in a slow, careful, perfect salute. "Specialist Callaway," Will said. His voice was steady, but only because he was making it steady. "Sir, welcome back to your aircraft, sir." Earl looked up at him. The cane shifted in his right hand. He brought his left hand up. The left, because the right one was holding the cane, and because the left one had been the hand he had used in 1969 to return salutes from officers on the ramp at Ankei. And he returned the salute of a major of Army aviation who was 30 years younger than him, and his eyes did the small narrowing thing they did when he was looking at a man and trying to figure out what the man already knew. "Major, you know my name." "Yes, sir, I do." "How?" "Sir, I am going to tell you how in about 15 minutes, when you have finished doing what you came over here to do. Right now, I want you to tell me what you need from me, and I'm going to get it for you, and we're going to fix this aircraft together, and then I'm going to tell you a story that my father asked me to tell you 11 years ago, and I have been carrying it the entire time." Earl Callaway looked at Will Garrison for a long, slow beat. The pale blue eyes did the narrowing thing again. He did not ask the obvious question, because Earl Callaway was the kind of man who knew when a question was about to answer itself if he just waited for it. He nodded once. "I need a torque wrench in the 75 to 100 foot-pound range, with a 1/2-inch drive and a deep socket sized for the main rotor retaining nut on a UH-1H, which on this airframe is going to be a 1 7/8 inch hex. I need a clean shop rag. I need a new cotter pin, the kind for the keyway on the Jesus nut, which is going to be a 1/8 inch by 2-inch stainless. I need a pair of needle nose pliers, and I need 2 minutes on top of the rotor head, by myself, with no one on the steps below me. Because what I am about to do is going to require my full attention, and I do not want anybody asking me questions while I am doing it. Can you get me those things, son?" "Yes, sir." Will Garrison turned around, fast, and walked the 6 steps to where Cody Brennan was standing with his arms crossed, and his face the colour of a brick. Will did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Cody, get the man what he asked for, right now. Torque wrench, deep socket, shop rag, cotter pin, needle nose, move." Cody Brennan opened his mouth one more time. He saw the look on Will Garrison's face and he closed it again. He turned around and walked quickly to the open red toolbox on the cart at the back of the helicopter, and he started pulling tools. The 2 younger mechanics moved out of his way. Jimmy Reyes was still standing where he had stopped earlier with his radio in his hand and his thumb hovering over the transmit button on the channel for security, and he had not yet made the call, and now he was not going to make it. Earl Callaway, in the meantime, was already on the access steps. He climbed them slowly, one at a time, with his cane in his left hand and his right hand on the rail. The steps were narrow and the climb was steep, and his right knee did not want to do it, but his right knee had not wanted to do a great many things in the last 10 years, and Earl had not let his right knee make the decisions in those 10 years, and he was not going to let it make the decision now. He reached the top of the steps. He stepped up onto the narrow walking platform that ran along the top of the engine deck behind the cockpit. He looked across the engine deck at the rotor mast rising up to the rotor head above him, and the rotor head sitting motionless in the bright Texas sunlight with the 2 long blades extending out to either side, and the small, smooth, domed cap of the Jesus nut on top of everything. And Earl Callaway, who had not stood on top of a Huey in 56 years, took one slow, careful breath and felt his entire body remember how to do something it had not done in more than half a century, the way a man's body remembers how to ride a bicycle. Cody Brennan came up the steps 2 minutes later with the torque wrench, the deep socket, the cotter pin, the needle nose pliers, and a clean white shop rag in a small canvas tool bag. He handed the bag up to Earl without speaking. He did not make eye contact. He went back down. Earl set the bag on the engine deck, opened it, took out the rag, wiped down the top of the rotor head, and looked carefully at the Jesus nut and the small split cotter pin sticking out the side of it. The cotter pin was in. But the cotter pin was not seated all the way against the side of the nut the way a properly seated cotter pin is seated. There was a tiny gap, maybe a 1/16 of an inch between the head of the cotter pin and the flat of the nut, and the gap meant exactly one thing to a man who had been trained to look for it. The nut had been backed off, very slightly, after the cotter pin had been installed, by the cumulative effect of vibration from however many ground runs the bird had done since the last time anybody had checked it. It was, in the technical sense, a tiny problem. The nut was still tight enough that the rotor head was not going to come off the mast in flight. But it was not tight enough to keep the rotor disc from finding play in the mast spline once per 3 rotations at takeoff RPM, and that play was exactly what the pilot had been feeling in the controls, and the play was exactly what was going to gall the spline if the bird ran up one more time without the nut being properly reseated. Earl took the needle nose pliers and gently straightened the legs of the cotter pin. He pulled the cotter pin out and dropped it into the canvas bag. He fitted the deep socket onto the torque wrench. He fitted the wrench onto the Jesus nut. And then, in the slow, deliberate way of a man who had done this exact procedure, under conditions a great deal worse than a sunny tarmac in Texas, he turned the wrench, by hand, with his right wrist exactly 1/4 of 1 full rotation clockwise, the sound a man could not have heard if a pin had dropped on the engine deck 30 feet away, until the click of the torque wrench's preset stop told him that the nut was now seated to the full 100 foot-pound spec for a UH-1H main rotor retaining nut. He took the wrench off. He picked up the new cotter pin. He fitted it through the keyway of the nut. He bent the legs of the cotter pin back against the flats of the nut on either side, snug, the way Chief Warrant Officer Eldon Pace had taught him to do it on the maintenance flight line at Vung Tau in March of 1969. He wiped the top of the rotor head one more time with the clean side of the rag. He put all of the tools back in the canvas bag. He looked at the Jesus nut for one more long second, and then he said very quietly, to nobody, and to everybody, and to a Chief Warrant Officer who had been dead since 1992, "Pace, old buddy, I think we've got her." He climbed down the steps as slowly and as carefully as he had climbed up them. He set the canvas bag on top of the toolbox cart at the back of the helicopter. He walked around to the front of the bird with his cane in his right hand. The entire ground crew was standing in a loose half circle around the cockpit. Jimmy Reyes had moved up close. Cody Brennan was standing with his arms uncrossed now and his mouth slightly open. The 2 younger mechanics were standing behind him, with the open expressions of men who were watching something happen that none of their training had prepared them for. Will Garrison was already back in the cockpit. Earl looked up at him through the cockpit window. He gave the small nod that crew chiefs had been giving Huey pilots from outside the aircraft for 60 years to mean she's good, sir. Take her up. Will Garrison nodded back. He pulled the throttle off cutoff slowly and rolled it forward. The starter motor whined. The Lickerming T-53 turbine engine caught and began its long climbing spool up, through the pitches of a Huey going to flight RPM. The rotor disc began to turn above the aircraft, slowly at first, then faster still, then to the steady, smooth, even thump, 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 thump of a Huey at takeoff RPM that anybody who has ever heard a Huey at takeoff RPM never forgets for the rest of their life. Will Garrison eased in collective. The bird came light on her skids. The skids lifted off the asphalt 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet, then 4 feet. And the rotor disc was clean, and the airframe was steady, and the controls in Will Garrison's hands were doing exactly what controls in a helicopter are supposed to do, and the low-frequency wobble that had aborted 3 takeoffs in 90 minutes was gone, as completely as if it had never been there at all. Will brought the bird up to a 15-foot hover, held it there for 10 seconds, set it back down on the skids as gently as a man sets a sleeping baby into a crib, and rolled the throttle back to flight idle. The crowd at the rope line, which had been watching the entire 90-minute drama from 40 yards away, did not cheer. The crowd at the rope line was dead silent for the space of about 5 seconds, and then a single voice from somewhere in the middle of the crowd shouted, "That's how you do it!" and the entire spectator line broke into applause that did not stop for the next 2 full minutes. Will Garrison did not get out of the cockpit right away. He sat in the left-hand seat with both hands resting on his knees, and his eyes closed for a long beat, and then he reached up and unbuckled his helmet and set it on the right-hand seat next to him, and he climbed out of the cockpit slowly, the way a man climbs out of a chair he's been sitting in for too long, and he walked the 4 steps around the nose of the bird to where Earl Callaway was standing in front of the right-hand skid, with his cane in his right hand and his left hand resting on the side of the aircraft. Will did not salute this time. Will reached out slowly with both hands and put his palms on Earl Callaway's shoulders, and looked into the old man's face from a foot away and said, "Sir, my name is William Garrison. My father was Captain Donald Garrison, United States Army, 1st Aviation Brigade, attached to the 1st Cavalry Division at Ankei in 1968 and 1969. He was a Huey pilot, He flew slicks for 14 months. He was the co-pilot on the day in November of 1969 when this aircraft, tail number 66-16718, took a hit in the tail rotor pedals over a clearing east of the Bongson Plain and went down hard and killed his aircraft commander, a chief warrant officer named Mickey Sloan from Pittsburgh. My father was wounded in the crash. He had a broken pelvis and a fractured left forearm and a piece of windshield glass in his right cheek that left a scar he carried for the rest of his life. He told me, sir, when I was 12 years old, sitting in the cab of his pickup truck on the way to a baseball game in Tucson, that the only reason he was alive to be driving me to that baseball game was because the door gunner on his bird that day had pulled him out of the wreck under fire and dragged him 50 yards to the tree line on his back, with one hand on his collar and the other hand returning fire from a sidearm, and had stayed with him in the tree line for the next 2 hours until the rescue bird came in. My father told me that the door gunner's name was Specialist 5 Earl Callaway, who everybody in the company called Doc because he had picked up some battlefield medic skills somewhere along the way, and was always the guy people went to when somebody got hurt on a mission. My father told me that he tried to find you, sir, after the war. He told me he wrote 3 letters to the Army Personnel Records Centre looking for your forwarding address, and he told me that all 3 letters came back with no information available. He told me that he carried it for the rest of his life, sir, that he had never been able to look you in the eye and tell you what he owed you. He told me, on the night before he died in a hospital bed in Tucson in 2014, 11 years ago, the last thing he ever said to me, find Earl Callaway. If you ever fly Hueys for a living, find Earl Callaway and tell him I never forgot what he did for Donnie. I am Donnie, sir. I am his son. He was Donnie to his crew chief, who was you. I have been looking for you for 11 years, sir, in every Huey reunion and every air show and every veteran event I have ever attended, and I never found you, sir. I never found you until you walked across my flight line today on a cane and tightened the Jesus nut on my father's helicopter by hand. Earl Callaway stood very still in front of the helicopter. His pale blue eyes were not narrow anymore. They were wide, and they were filling. He looked up at Will Garrison for a long, long moment, and his mouth moved twice without making any sound, and then he said, in a voice that was suddenly half a century younger than the 81 years it had been carrying around the inside of, Donnie's boy. You're Donnie's boy. I held you when you were a baby. He sent me a picture in 1971, a Christmas card from Tucson, with you in his lap in a little red sweater. I kept that card for 30 years before I lost it in a move. I have wondered about you, son, every Christmas for 54 years. Will Garrison's face came apart very slowly, the way a piece of wood splits along a grain that has been there the whole time waiting for the right pressure. He pulled Earl Callaway gently into the kind of embrace a man gives another man only twice in a normal lifetime, and he held it for the space of about 10 seconds, and Earl held him back with one arm because the other arm was still holding the cane, and somewhere over their shoulders Cody Brennan, who had spent 90 minutes failing to fix what an old man on a cane had fixed in 30 seconds, and who had been an inch away from calling security on him, took off his ball cap and held it against his chest with both hands. Jimmy Reyes was openly crying. The 2 younger mechanics were standing very still. Out at the rope line, a 9-year-old boy in a blue cap with an embroidered Huey on the front had pulled free of his father's hand and had ducked under the rope, and Garrett Callaway, Earl's grandson, did not stop the boy this time. He let his son run because Garrett Callaway had just put together, watching from the rope line, that his grandfather was the person on the tarmac that everybody on the tarmac was looking at, the way you look at a person you've been waiting your whole life to find, and Garrett Callaway had a feeling that whatever was about to happen next on that piece of asphalt was a thing his 9-year-old son was going to remember for the rest of his life, and he was right. Mason Callaway ran across 40 feet of hot tarmac in his blue cap and his light-up sneakers and threw both of his arms around his great-grandfather's leg and held on. Earl looked down. He let go of Will Garrison with his free arm and laid the palm of his hand on the top of his great-grandson's head. The boy looked up at him. "Great-grandpa, did you really fix the helicopter?" "Yes, son, I did." "Did you fly on this exact one in the war?" Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked up at the side of the bird at the white block letters of the tail number 66-16718, painted just above the cargo door. "Yes, son, I did. A long time ago. Will you tell me about it?" Earl looked down at the boy for a long beat. He looked at Will Garrison, who was wiping his eyes with the back of one wrist, and at Garrett, who had walked up behind Mason now and was standing 6 feet back with one hand over his mouth, and at Jimmy Reyes and Cody Brennan and the two younger mechanics and the spectators at the rope line, and he looked, finally, back down at the boy. "Yeah, son, I think I will. I think today's the day I'm going to start." If this story has reached you the way it has reached me, type the word reunion in the comments right now, because the next 20 minutes of what happened on that tarmac and in the year that followed are the kind of thing I want as many people as possible to see. Will Garrison did not fly the airshow demo that afternoon. Will Garrison flew a different demo. He went into the cockpit, made a single radio call to the show director on a private channel, and then walked out to the spectator line with a portable wireless microphone in his hand, and stood in front of 1,000 people on the south end of the tarmac and told them, in a steady voice that broke only twice, exactly what had just happened on the flight line in front of them. He told them about his father. He told them about the crash in 1969. He told them about the door gunner who had pulled his father out of the wreck. He told them that the door gunner was standing next to him right now, on a cane, in an old field jacket, 81 years old, named Earl Callaway, and that the helicopter behind him was the same helicopter the door gunner had served on in 1969, and that the door gunner had fixed the helicopter in 30 seconds, with a torquey wrench and a cotter pin after the certified restoration team had failed to fix it in 90 minutes. He told them that the entire museum was honoured beyond words by Earl's presence, and that the next demo flight of the day was going to be flown with Earl Callaway as the honorary co-pilot in the left-hand seat, if Earl was willing. Earl was willing. Earl Callaway, who had not been off the ground in a Huey since November of 1969, climbed slowly into the left-hand seat of tail number 66-16718 with Will Garrison's help, and Will took the right-hand seat, and Will flew the bird up to 200 feet over the runway and held a slow circle for the entire 15-minute slot, while 1,000 people on the ground watched. And somewhere in the second minute of that flight, Earl Callaway took the cyclic in his right hand for the first time in 56 years, with Will Garrison's hand resting lightly on top of his to guide him, and the old man flew the helicopter for 90 seconds himself before he handed the controls back. He did not say anything during the flight. He did not need to. When the bird set down on the asphalt at the end of the slot, and the rotor disc spun down to a stop, and Earl climbed out and walked across the tarmac on his cane back to where his great-grandson was waiting, Mason Callaway threw both arms around him again, and Earl Callaway picked the boy up off the ground for the first time in 3 years, because his back had been bad and his arms had been weak, and the doctor had told him not to lift. But Earl Callaway picked the boy up anyway and held him for a long minute and put him down again, and Mason Callaway, 9 years old, looked up at his great-grandfather and said, "Great-grandpa, was that the best day you ever had?" Earl thought about it for a long second. He thought about Doris and the wedding day in 1968 before he had shipped out. He thought about the day Mason's grandfather had been born in 1972. He thought about the day in 1989 when he had bought his first house. He thought about a few other days in 81 years that had been very good days, and then he said, "Son, it's in the top 3. It might be the top 1. I'll have to think about it for a while." The Lone Star Vertical Flight Foundation has, since that Saturday, formally invited Earl Callaway to serve as the Foundation's volunteer technical consultant for all matters related to the maintenance of UH-1H aircraft, an offer that Earl accepted on the condition that no money change hands and that he be allowed to come to the hangar in Dallas only when his health permits. He drives up 2 Saturdays a month. Cody Brennan, the lead mechanic, has spent every one of those Saturdays at Earl's elbow with a notebook in his hand, asking the kind of questions that the maintenance manuals do not answer, and Cody Brennan has, in 8 months, learned more about the inside of a Huey from an 81-year-old door gunner with a cane than he had learned in 18 months of formal restoration work before that. Cody has stopped using the word certified in the way he used to use it. He says now, when people ask him about his qualifications on the Foundation's aircraft, that he is learning from a man who knows. The original logbook of tail number 66-16718, the brown leather folder that had survived all 6 decades and 7 owners, by a series of small accidents the Foundation's director liked to call divine intervention, has been opened to the page for November 1969 and laid in a glass case in the Foundation's hangar in Dallas, with the entry for the hard landing east of the Bongson plane visible to visitors, and the names of the crew on that flight typed in faded ink at the top of the page: Aircraft Commander CW2 Michael R. Sloan, KIA, Co-Pilot CPT Donald J. Garrison, WIA, Crew Chief and Door Gunner SP5 Earl T. Callaway. Will Garrison and Earl Callaway have spent 4 weekends together at Earl's small ranch-style house on the edge of Hewitt, Texas. talking about Donnie Garrison, sharing photographs, looking through a small cardboard box of letters and Christmas cards that Earl had kept in the back of a closet for 50 years. And on the last of those weekends, Will Garrison drove Earl Callaway to the Texas State Veterans Cemetery in Killeen, where Earl's wife Doris is buried, and the two of them stood at her headstone for a long time without speaking, and Will Garrison laid a small folded piece of paper at the base of the headstone with 3 handwritten sentences on it. And Earl Callaway has not asked him what the 3 sentences were, because Earl Callaway is the kind of man who knows when a thing has been said between living men and a dead woman and is not for him to read. Earl Callaway drove home from the Heart of Texas Regional Air Show that Saturday evening in his 1996 Ford F250 with his great-grandson Mason in the passenger seat, because Garrett and his wife had needed to head back to Hewitt early to check on the dog, and Mason had asked very quietly if he could ride home with great-grandpa instead. And Garrett had looked at his father-in-law and his son and had said, "Yes, of course, son. That sounds just right." The drive home was 18 miles. Earl took it slow, the way he took every drive slow now, and the late afternoon Texas sun was coming down golden across the fields on either side of the highway, and the boy in the passenger seat was looking out the window with his blue cap pulled low against the glare and his small hands folded in his lap. "About 5 miles from home," Mason said without looking over. "Great-grandpa." "Yes, son." "When you go to heaven someday, are you going to see the man you pulled out of the helicopter? The man who was Major Garrison's daddy?" Earl Callaway thought about that for a long beat. He kept his eyes on the road. The cane was on the bench seat between them. The old field jacket was warm on his shoulders. "Yes, son, I believe I will." "Will you tell him hi from me?" "I'll do that, son. I'll tell him hi from you." "And will you tell him thank you?" Earl looked over at the boy in the passenger seat for the first time since he had asked the question. "Thank you for what, son?" "For making it possible for Major Garrison to be born so he could fly the helicopter today so we could see it." Earl Callaway, who had pulled a man out of a burning Huey in November of 1969 and had carried him 50 yards to a tree line under fire, and had stayed with him for 2 hours until the rescue bird came in, and had then spent the next 56 years quietly being a husband and a father and a crop duster mechanic in Texas, without ever telling anybody what he had done in those 2 hours in that tree line, looked at his 9-year-old great-grandson in the passenger seat of his pickup truck on a state highway in central Texas in the golden Saturday evening light, and his eyes filled, and he reached over with his right hand and laid it on top of his great-grandson's small folded hands, and he said very quietly, "Yeah, son, I will tell him that. I will tell him exactly that." If this story has done anything to you at all today, do 4 small things for me before you click away from this video. Subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories like this one coming every week, and every one of them is true in the ways that matter. Share this story with one person in your life who needs to be reminded that the quiet old men on the cane in the corner of the parking lot at the air show are not what they look like from the rope line. The next time you see an old veteran in a faded field jacket, leave him be unless you can think of something kind to say. And if you can think of something kind to say it, because he has been waiting longer than you can possibly imagine for somebody to say it. And if you have a great-grandfather or a grandfather or an uncle or a neighbour who served in any war anywhere, call him this week. Call him before the weekend. Call him because there is going to come a day, and it is going to come sooner than you think, when the phone in his house is going to ring and nobody's going to answer it. And on that day you're going to wish you had called him on this day. And the only difference between those 2 days is whether or not you pick up your phone right now. Until next time, God bless our veterans. And God bless every door gunner who ever climbed into a Huey and came home again.